Call the cops. He's riding a jet ski on a lake he owns. That's the level of genius I was dealing with when the HOA president called in sirens because I had the nerve to enjoy my own water. Apparently somewhere between planting petunias and measuring mailbox heights, she appointed herself Admiral of Neighborhood Lakes. 3 patrol cars, 1 very confused deputy, and a woman yelling about community resource violations. My weekend took a turn I didn't see coming, and trust me, it didn't stop there. She had binoculars, noise charts, and something that looked suspiciously like a mood board of my shoreline. What followed was part courtroom drama, part comedy special, and 100% HOA nonsense. Ever dealt with a neighbor who thinks property lines are optional? Comment below because this saga might just top it. Moving to my grandfather's ranch was supposed to be the start of a simpler life. After 10 years of coding software in a cramped downtown apartment, inheriting 180 acres of Texas countryside felt like winning the lottery. The old farmhouse needed work, sure, but the real prize was the lake right in the middle of the property. My grandfather had enjoyed his morning coffee beside it since 1987. The HOA neighborhood that bordered my property was built sometime after 2010, long after Grandpa had already been enjoying his morning coffee by this very lake. I spent my first week just walking the property lines, checking fences, and getting familiar with what was now mine. The deed was clear as day, 180 acres, including all natural water features and mineral rights. But it wasn't until I saw that lake sparkling in the afternoon sun that I knew exactly how I wanted to spend my weekends. I drove into town that Friday and bought myself a bright blue jet ski. Nothing too fancy, just something reliable that could give me a few hours of peace and quiet on the water. When I told the clerk I had my own lake, he was impressed. And honestly, so was I. Saturday morning came, and I was out there at sunrise, skimming across the water for the first time. The feeling was incredible. Pure freedom with nothing but the sound of the engine and the wind in my face. I must have spent 3 hours out there, just enjoying the fact that this was all mine. No crowds, no fees, no rules except the ones I made. When I finally pulled back to shore, I noticed a woman standing at the edge of my property, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was probably in her late 30s with shoulder-length brown hair and a cardigan that had seen better days. She waved at me with what looked like a friendly smile, so I shut off the engine and walked over to say hello. "Beautiful lake you've got there," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Knight, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. I live just over there." She pointed to a house about 200 yards away, clearly within the HOA development. "I wanted to come over and introduce myself, welcome you to the neighborhood." Her smile seemed genuine enough, but there was something in her eyes that made me cautious. "We have some community guidelines about noise levels, especially on weekends," she continued. "I'm sure you understand how sound carries across water. We like to keep things peaceful for all our residents." I felt my jaw tighten slightly, but I kept my voice friendly. "I appreciate you stopping by, Mrs. Knight," I replied, "but this is private ranch property. I'm not part of your HOA. Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Oh, I know that," she said quickly. "But we're all neighbors here, right? We should all be considerate of each other." I pulled the folded property deed from my back pocket and showed it to her. "This lake has been in my family since 1987, I explained, long before your neighborhood was even planned. I understand you want quiet, but I have every right to use my own property." She glanced at the deed and I saw something flicker across her face. Frustration, maybe even anger. Of course," she said, backing away slightly. "I just thought you might want to be a good neighbor." With that, she turned and walked back toward the HOA development, leaving me standing there with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. I spent the rest of the day thinking about our conversation. Something about Victoria Knight didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe she was just overly protective of her neighborhood, or maybe she was one of those people who like to control everything around them. Either way, I wasn't about to let someone else dictate what I could do on my own land. As the sun set over the lake, I fired up the jet ski one more time and took a victory lap around the entire shoreline. This was my property, my lake, and my life. If Mrs. Knight had a problem with that, she was welcome to take it up with the deed office. But as I was loading the jet ski back onto its trailer, I noticed Victoria standing at her kitchen window, watching me with binoculars. The friendly neighbor act was already dropping, and something told me this was just the beginning of what was going to be a very long fight. Little did I know that while I was enjoying my peaceful evening by the lake, Victoria was already sitting at her old laptop, typing into an internet search engine. How to stop neighbor noise legal. I had no idea that the war had already begun. Monday morning brought an unwelcome surprise in my mailbox. A handwritten letter that was 3 pages long and bore the official letterhead of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. The envelope was addressed to the occupant of 123 Ranch Road in Victoria Knight's precise handwriting. I knew this wasn't going to be good news. Victoria's letter accused me of excessive noise pollution and demanded I stop all motorized activity, or else she'd contact authorities. It was signed with her own mock seal like she ran a real government. The audacity was breathtaking. But what bothered me most was how official she was trying to make it all sound. She was throwing around legal terms and making threats like she actually had some authority over my ranch. I decided I needed to talk to someone who'd been in the area longer than I had, someone who might know what I was dealing with. My nearest neighbor outside the HOA was Olivia Harrington, a friendly woman in her 50s who lived in an old farmhouse about half a mile down the road. Olivia had been in the area for over 20 years and had watched the HOA development go up from nothing. When I showed her Victoria's letter, she let out a long sigh and shook her head. "Oh, honey, you're not the first person Victoria's gone after," she said, pouring us both some iced tea. "She's made life miserable for at least 4 families that I know of. People have moved away because she kept calling the police about dogs barking in the middle of the afternoon. Other families had to put up tall fences because she complained that their children's playground was an eyesore visible from her kitchen window." Olivia explained that Victoria had become HOA president about 2 years ago after somehow convincing the previous president to step down. "She's gotten worse since her divorce," Olivia continued. "Lost her job at the bank for some kind of conflict with her co-workers, and now being HOA president is basically her full-time job. She treats it like she's running a small country." The more Olivia talked, the clearer the picture became. Victoria Knight wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was someone who needed to control everything around her. And my private lake was apparently her next target. "The thing is," Olivia added, "she's smart about it. She knows just enough about local ordinances and legal procedures to make people's lives difficult, even when she doesn't actually have any authority." I drove home that evening with a much better understanding of what I was up against. This wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation or by showing Victoria my property deed again. She was going to escalate the situation until one of us backed down, and I had no intention of giving up my rights to my own land. I spent the evening researching Texas property law and noise ordinances, making sure I understood exactly where I stood legally. Everything I found confirmed what I already knew. I had every right to use my private lake however I wanted, as long as I wasn't violating any environmental regulations or safety laws. Tuesday evening, I decided to take the jet ski out for another ride, partly because I enjoyed it and partly because I wasn't going to be intimidated by Victoria's threats. As I pulled away from shore, I noticed her standing in her backyard with what looked like a notepad, timing my activities and possibly measuring noise levels with some kind of device. The woman was actually documenting my use of my own property like she was building a legal case. I gave her a friendly wave as I passed by her section of the shoreline, and she responded by furiously scribbling in her notepad. This was getting ridiculous, but I had to admit there was something almost comical about the whole situation. When I got back to the house that night, I found a voicemail from someone at the county office. Victoria had apparently called them to report repeated violations of community noise standards at my address. The county employee was polite but seemed confused, asking me to call back to clarify the situation regarding the alleged violations. I realized that Victoria was already escalating beyond angry letters. She was bringing in government agencies. As I was getting ready for bed, I made a decision. If Mrs. Knight wanted to play hardball, I was going to find out everything I could about her and her track record as a neighbor. I was done being reactive. It was time to go on offense. The next morning, I called the county office back and explained the situation. "Sir, if this is a private lake on private property, we don't actually have jurisdiction over recreational noise," the clerk explained. "Unless you're violating specific decibel limits during restricted nighttime hours, There's really nothing we can regulate. She asked for my property information to close the complaint, and I could hear her typing as I gave her the details. Mr. Walker, this is the third noise complaint we've received about your address this month, she said. Are you sure this isn't some kind of neighbor dispute? I assured her it was exactly that, and she promised to flag any future complaints from Victoria's address as potentially frivolous. That afternoon brought another escalation I hadn't expected. As I was checking my mail, I noticed a car parked across the street with someone taking photographs of my property. When I walked closer to investigate, the car quickly drove away, but not before I got a look at the driver. It was Victoria Knight. She was now conducting surveillance on my property like some kind of private investigator. The whole situation was becoming increasingly surreal, but I was starting to see a pattern in her behavior. Every time one of her official complaints got rejected, she escalated to the next level of harassment. I had a feeling that her next move was going to involve law enforcement, and I wanted to be ready for it. I spent that evening organizing all my property documents and preparing for what I suspected would be her most dramatic escalation yet. I spent Wednesday morning doing something I'd gotten pretty good at during my software engineering days: online research. Victoria Knight's name turned up in more places than I expected, and none of them painted a very flattering picture. Public records showed Victoria had been involved in at least 6 neighborhood disputes, some involving restraining orders and even emotional distress claims. There was a particularly interesting piece from last year about a lawsuit filed against the HOA by a family whose children had been banned from using the community playground because Victoria deemed their activities disruptive to the residential atmosphere. The most interesting discovery came when I searched for property records around my ranch. I found a 2015 record where she tried to buy part of the lake from Grandpa and got rejected flat. The rejection letter was still in the public records, stating that Mr. Walker has no intention of selling any portion of his family ranch, particularly the lake property. So Victoria's interest in my lake wasn't new. She'd been coveting this water for years. Thursday brought another phone call, this time from someone at the state environmental office. Victoria had filed a complaint about potential water contamination from unauthorized motorized vehicles in a natural water body. The state worker explained that they were required to investigate all environmental complaints, but she sounded as skeptical as the county noise control officer had been. Ma'am, if this is a private lake on private property, we don't actually have jurisdiction unless there's evidence of contamination affecting public waterways, she explained. I provided her with my property information and deed number, and she promised to close the complaint once she verified the lake's private status. After lunch, I decided to pay Olivia another visit to see what else she might know about Victoria's history in the area. Victoria moved here about 6 years ago with her ex-husband, Olivia explained. Right from the start, she was obsessed with that lake of yours. She used to walk her property line every morning, staring across at the water like she was planning something. Olivia mentioned that Victoria had lost her job at the local bank due to conflicts with customers and coworkers. Her ex-husband said living with her felt like surveillance. She wanted to control everything. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd lost control of her marriage, her job, and most of her personal relationships, and who was now using her HOA position to control whatever she could. Friday evening, as I was preparing for another peaceful weekend by the lake, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a local area code. Mr. Walker, said an authoritative voice, this is Deputy Nathaniel Gray with the County Sheriff's Department. We've received multiple reports of illegal activity at your property, and we need to schedule a time to investigate these allegations. My stomach dropped. Victoria had escalated to calling the actual police. What kind of illegal activity? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The reports mention unauthorized use of community water resources and possible environmental violations, Deputy Gray replied. We'll need to see documentation of your property ownership and inspect the alleged violation. I explained to Deputy Gray that the lake was on my private property and that I had all the necessary documentation to prove it. He seemed surprised by this information and asked me to repeat the property address twice. Sir, if this is indeed private property, then we may have received false information, he said, his tone shifting slightly. Would you be available tomorrow morning for us to verify the property boundaries and resolve this matter? I agreed to meet with him at 10 a.m. Saturday, and he advised me to have all my property documents ready for inspection. After hanging up, I realized that Victoria had just made a serious mistake. Filing false police reports was actually a crime, and she just created an official record of her harassment. As I was thinking about the best way to handle tomorrow's police visit, I noticed Victoria standing at her fence line with what appeared to be a camera, taking pictures of my property. The woman was documenting everything, building what she probably thought was a case against me. But what she was actually doing was creating evidence of her own obsessive harassment behavior. I decided to return the favor and pulled out my phone to take a few pictures of her surveillance activity. If she wanted to play the documentation game, I was going to make sure I had my own evidence of her behavior. As I watched her scurry back to her house when she realized I was photographing her, I couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow's police visit was going to be very interesting, and I had a feeling Victoria Knight was about to learn a valuable lesson about the difference between HOA authority and actual legal authority. The evening before the police visit, I sat on my porch looking out at the lake and thinking about how much my life had changed since moving to the ranch. What was supposed to be a peaceful retreat from city life had turned into a battle for my basic property rights. But as I watched the sunset reflect off the water that had belonged to my family for decades, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Victoria Knight might have experience intimidating her neighbors, but she'd picked the wrong person to mess with this time. I had the law on my side, the documentation to prove it, and the patience to see this through to the end. Tomorrow was going to be the beginning of the end of Victoria's harassment campaign, though neither of us knew just how dramatically it was all going to unfold. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather and a perfect opportunity to settle this dispute once and for all. I gathered my deed, registration, and copies of her letters, everything ready for Deputy Gray. At 9:45 a.m., I was sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee and my documentation folder, waiting for Deputy Gray to arrive. I could see Victoria standing at her kitchen window, obviously watching for the police cars to show up. She'd probably been awake since dawn, preparing her own presentation for the officers. At exactly 10 a.m., I heard the crunch of gravel as a patrol car made its way down my driveway. Deputy Nathaniel Gray emerged from the vehicle, and Victoria appeared at her property line almost immediately, carrying what looked like a thick folder of her own. Deputy Gray looked like he'd seen plenty of neighbor disputes before. This was just another Saturday morning call to him. "Mr. Walker," Deputy Gray began, "I'm here to investigate reports of unauthorized water vehicle use and possible environmental violations. Can you show me the area in question and provide documentation of your ownership?" I stood up and gestured toward the lake, which was clearly visible from where we were standing. "Deputy, this is my private lake on my private ranch," I said, handing him my folder. "Everything you need to verify that is right here." While Deputy Gray was reviewing my documents, Victoria approached us with her own folder and what appeared to be a prepared speech. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said in her most authoritative voice. She launched into a speech about shared resources and community standards. She handed Deputy Gray a stack of papers that included photographs, what looked like noise level measurements, and several pages of typed complaints. The deputy was looking back and forth between the lake and Victoria's house, and I could see him doing mental calculations about property lines and distances. Deputy Gray spent several minutes reviewing both sets of documents while Victoria continued her presentation about community standards and property values. When he finally looked up, he was holding my property deed and had a slightly puzzled expression on his face. "Mrs. Knight," he said carefully, "according to this documentation, the lake is located entirely on Mr. Walker's private property. The deed shows clear ownership dating back to 1987, which predates your HOA development by more than 20 years. Victoria's confident expression faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Well, that may be what the paperwork says," she replied, "but we have community agreements about water usage and noise levels that affect everyone in the area." Deputy Gray spoke up with a hint of amusement in his voice. "Ma'am, with all due respect, community agreements don't override private property rights. If Mr. Walker owns this lake, he can pretty much do whatever he wants with it, as long as he's not breaking any environmental laws or safety regulations." He turned to me and asked, "Do you have any motor vehicle registration for your watercraft?" I pulled out my jet ski registration and insurance documents, which were all completely current and legal. "Everything checks out," Deputy Gray said. "This is private property. The watercraft is properly registered, and there don't appear to be any actual violations here. Victoria wasn't ready to give up yet. But surely there are noise ordinances that apply to everyone, she insisted. The sound from that machine carries across the entire neighborhood. It's disrupting the peaceful enjoyment of our properties. Deputy Gray consulted a small notebook and then looked back at Victoria. Mrs. Knight, noise ordinances typically apply to activities between residential properties, not recreational activities on private land. Unless Mr. Walker is violating specific decibel limits during restricted hours, there's no violation here. He paused and fixed Victoria with a stern look. However, filing false police reports is a misdemeanor offense. I'd strongly advise you to verify your facts before making future complaints. As Deputy Gray prepared to leave, he approached me privately. Mr. Walker, I've been doing this job for 5 years, and this is one of the more unusual calls I've responded to, he said with a grin. I've never had someone call the police to report illegal activity on someone else's private property. You might want to document any future harassment from your neighbor, just in case this escalates further. He handed me his business card and added, if she continues to file false reports, that becomes a pattern of behavior that we can actually do something about. As the patrol car drove away, I noticed Victoria standing at her fence line, watching it leave with an expression of shock and anger. The friendly neighbor mask had completely dropped, and I could see the real Victoria Knight for the first time, someone who couldn't accept that she didn't have control over my property. That evening, as I was enjoying a celebratory jet ski ride around my lake, I realized that Victoria's escalation to law enforcement had actually backfired in the best possible way. Not only had the police confirmed my property rights, but they'd also created an official record of her false reporting. Deputy Gray's warning about documenting future harassment was good advice, and I decided to start keeping a detailed log of Victoria's activities. As I pulled the jet ski back to shore, I could see her standing at her kitchen window, watching me with binoculars. The woman clearly wasn't done yet, and something told me that her next move was going to be even more desperate than calling the police. I had no idea how right I was about that prediction. Over the next few days, Victoria's behavior became increasingly erratic and obsessive. She started walking the property line multiple times per day, taking photographs from different angles, and even tried to measure the distance from the lake to her house, using what appeared to be a measuring tape. It was like watching someone slowly lose their grip on reality, and I knew that the final confrontation was coming soon. Sunday morning brought a temporary peace to my ranch, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Victoria had been humiliated in front of the police, and someone with her personality wasn't going to just accept defeat and move on. I spent the morning doing some routine maintenance around the property, keeping one eye on the lake and another on Victoria's house. Sure enough, around noon, I noticed her walking along our shared property line with what appeared to be a measuring tape and a notebook. She was trying to find some angle, some technicality that might give her leverage over my lake access. I called Deputy Gray. He wasn't surprised. Mr. Walker, I'm not surprised to hear from you, Deputy Gray said when he answered. Mrs. Knight called our dispatch again last night, claiming you were operating your jet ski after dark in violation of some made-up ordinance. The dispatcher told her we wouldn't respond unless she had evidence of an actual crime being committed. He paused and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Between you and me, we've had more calls from Mrs. Knight in the past month than we usually get from that entire neighborhood in a year. She's becoming what we call a frequent flyer, and not in a good way. Deputy Gray's tone was friendly but professional, and I got the impression that he was genuinely trying to help me navigate the situation. Monday brought another escalation in Victoria's campaign against my lake activities. This time she'd apparently contacted someone at the State Environmental Protection Office, claiming that my jet ski was causing erosion and habitat destruction in a sensitive wetland area. The state inspector who called me sounded tired and slightly annoyed, like he'd dealt with similar nuisance complaints before. Sir, we're required to investigate all environmental reports, he explained. But based on the property information you've provided, this appears to be a private lake on private land with no connection to public waterways. Unless you're dumping chemicals or causing downstream contamination, there's really nothing for us to regulate here. Tuesday morning brought a visit from the state environmental inspector. The inspector checked water quality, erosion, and my jet ski. His verdict, one of the cleanest lakes I've seen. When I told him about Victoria's campaign of harassment, he shook his head sympathetically. We get about 50 false environmental reports a year from people trying to use our agency to settle personal disputes. It's a waste of taxpayer resources and frankly, it's annoying as hell. Wednesday evening brought the most surreal development yet. I was grilling dinner on my back porch when I noticed Victoria setting up what appeared to be a tripod and camera at the edge of her property, aimed directly at my lake. She was now documenting my activities with professional equipment, like she was conducting some kind of surveillance operation. I decided this had gone far enough and walked over to the property line to have a direct conversation with her. "Mrs. Knight," I called out, "can we talk for a minute about all this?" She looked up from her camera with an expression that was equal parts determination and desperation. "I'm documenting the ongoing violations of community peace and environmental standards," she announced as if she was reading from a script. "Victoria," I said, using her first name deliberately, "there are no violations. The police confirmed that. The state environmental inspector confirmed that. This is my private property, and I have every right to use it however I want." She stood up and faced me directly, and I could see that she was genuinely upset about losing control of this situation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I've worked too hard to build a peaceful community here. I won't let one selfish person destroy everything we've accomplished." The conversation was clearly not going to be productive, so I decided to try a different approach. "Mrs. Knight, what if we set up some specific times when I use the jet ski? Maybe weekends only, or just weekend afternoons." Victoria's response surprised me with its intensity. "No," she snapped. "That lake should be quiet all the time. It's supposed to be a natural, peaceful space, not some noisy playground for your toys." I realized then that this wasn't really about noise levels or community standards. Victoria wanted complete control over everything she could see from her property, including my lake. There was no compromise possible because she fundamentally believed she should have authority over land she didn't own. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I replied, "but this is my property and my lake. I'm going to continue using it responsibly, just like I have been." As I walked away, I heard her call out, "We'll see about that." Thursday morning brought what I hoped would be the final escalation in Victoria's harassment campaign. I was checking my mail when I heard sirens and saw Deputy Gray's patrol car racing down my driveway. My heart sank as I realized that Victoria had made another false report, but this time she'd apparently claimed it was some kind of emergency. Deputy Gray emerged from the car, and I could see that he was not happy about being called out again. "Mr. Walker," Deputy Gray called out, "we received a report of threats and intimidation. Mrs. Knight claims you approached her property last night and made threatening statements." I felt my stomach drop as I realized Victoria had escalated to making false accusations about my character and behavior. "Deputy Gray, I did speak with Mrs. Knight last evening," I said carefully, "but it was a civil conversation about trying to find a compromise. I never made any threats or intimidating statements." I could see Victoria standing at her fence line, apparently ready to give her version of events. Deputy Gray pulled out a small notebook and asked me to describe exactly what had happened during our conversation. As I recounted the discussion about setting specific jet ski times and Victoria's angry refusal to consider any compromise, I watched his expression shift from professional concern to obvious skepticism. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "would you mind if I took another look at your property deed? I want to make sure I have all the facts straight for my report." I retrieved my property documents from the house, and this time I included the timeline of Victoria's harassment activities that I'd been documenting. Deputy Gray spent several minutes reviewing everything, while Victoria waited anxiously at her property line. When he finished reading, Deputy Gray looked up at me with an expression that was part amusement and part disbelief. "Mr. Walker, let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said. "Mrs. Knight has been filing complaints about your use of a lake that's entirely on your private property, that you've owned since before her neighborhood even existed." I nodded and he continued, "And now she's claiming you threatened her when you tried to offer a compromise about when you'd use your own lake." The absurdity of the situation seemed to be dawning on him in real time. After reviewing all the evidence, Deputy Gray returned to give me his conclusion. "Mr. Walker, based on my investigation, there's no evidence that any threats were made. And frankly, Mrs. Knight's story doesn't make much sense given the property ownership situation." He paused and looked over at Victoria, who was still standing at her fence line. However, this is the fourth false report we've received from Mrs. Knight in 2 weeks, and that's starting to become a pattern of behavior that we need to address. I felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation. It sounded like Victoria's harassment campaign was about to backfire on her in a serious way. Little did I know that the next 24 hours would bring the most dramatic conclusion to this whole ridiculous situation. And Deputy Gray was going to get the biggest laugh of his law enforcement career. Friday morning, I woke up with a new sense of determination. Victoria's escalation to false police reports had crossed a line that I couldn't ignore, and Deputy Gray's warning about documenting her harassment pattern gave me an idea. If she wanted to make this a public matter, I was going to make it very public indeed. I spent the morning at the hardware store purchasing materials for what I was already calling my public education campaign. By noon, I had everything I needed to turn my property deed into a neighborhood teaching tool, and I was actually looking forward to Victoria's reaction. I made a massive sign, Perman Ranch Lake, HOA Free Zone. Below it, a timeline of Victoria's antics. I mounted it on a sturdy post right at my property line, where anyone driving past could see it clearly. The sign also included a smaller notice that read, Property boundaries verified by county records, deed on file. It was professional, factual, and absolutely guaranteed to irritate Victoria Knight. As I was installing the sign, I noticed her watching from her kitchen window, and I gave her a friendly wave when I saw her binoculars come out. The real masterstroke came when I decided to invite my neighbors over for an informal barbecue and property rights discussion. I put flyers in mailboxes throughout the area, including homes in Victoria's HOA development, inviting everyone to learn about local property history and enjoy some good food. Olivia Harrington was the first to respond positively, followed by several families from both inside and outside the HOA community. Even some of Victoria's immediate neighbors expressed interest in attending. Saturday afternoon brought perfect weather for my impromptu neighborhood gathering. About 15 people showed up, including several families with children who were fascinated by the jet ski and excited about the possibility of swimming in the lake. I had prepared a simple presentation about property rights and the history of the ranch. The most popular part was when I showed the original deed from 1987 next to current photos of Victoria's house, demonstrating that the lake had been private property for decades before her neighborhood existed. Olivia asked the question that everyone was thinking, so Mrs. Knight has been filing false complaints about activities on your private property. When I confirmed this and showed them the timeline of her harassment, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. These people had been living under Victoria's authoritarian HOA leadership for years, and many of them had their own stories about her unreasonable demands and controlling behavior. She tried to fine us for having the wrong color mailbox, said one neighbor. She demanded we remove our children's play set because it was visible from her kitchen window, added another. The community was ready for Victoria Knight to face some consequences. As if on cue, Victoria herself appeared at the edge of my property, just as I was explaining her pattern of false police reports. She marched across my lawn like she owned the place, carrying what appeared to be a legal document and wearing her most authoritative expression. This gathering is a violation of HOA community standards, she announced to the assembled crowd. I'm ordering everyone to disperse immediately. The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the birds chirping by the lake. Then Olivia started laughing, followed by several other people, until the entire group was chuckling at Victoria's presumption that she had authority over my private property and my invited guests. Mrs. Knight, I said, as politely as I could manage, this is my private property and these are my invited guests. You have no authority here whatsoever. I held up my property deed for everyone to see. This document gives me the right to use my land however I choose, including hosting barbecues, operating my jet ski, and educating my neighbors about property rights. Victoria's face was turning red with frustration and embarrassment. We'll see about that, she said, pulling out her cell phone. I'm calling the police right now to report this illegal gathering and your continued harassment of HOA residents. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances, and I could see them realizing that they were witnessing Victoria Knight's final meltdown in real time. True to her word, Victoria called 911 right there in front of everyone, claiming that I was hosting an illegal assembly on disputed property and harassing HOA members. What she didn't know was that Deputy Gray had already flagged her number in their system as a repeat false reporter, and the dispatcher was tired of dealing with her complaints. While we waited for the police to arrive, my neighbors continued to enjoy the barbecue and ask questions about property law and HOA authority. Victoria stood at the edge of the group like an unwelcome party crasher, furiously typing notes on her phone and occasionally taking pictures of my guests. When the patrol car finally arrived 20 minutes later, Deputy Gray stepped out with an expression that was equal parts professional duty and personal entertainment. He was about to get the biggest laugh of his law enforcement career, and Victoria Knight was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life about the difference between HOA authority and actual legal power. Deputy Nathaniel Gray approached my property, and I could see immediately that his attitude was different from previous visits. Instead of responding to another one of Victoria's emergency calls, he was clearly here on a different mission entirely. "Mr. Walker," he called out as he walked toward my group of neighbors, "I need to speak with you and Mrs. Knight about an ongoing investigation." Victoria stepped forward confidently, apparently believing that the police had finally arrived to arrest me for some imaginary crime. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly," she said in her most authoritative voice. "This man has been harassing HOA residents and hosting illegal gatherings on disputed property." Deputy Gray looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral, but privately amused. "Actually, Mrs. Knight," Deputy Gray replied, "I'm not here about Mr. Walker's barbecue, which is perfectly legal on his private property. I'm here because our department has completed an investigation into multiple false police reports filed from your address." Victoria's confident expression faltered as the deputy continued. "Over the past 6 weeks, you filed 8 separate complaints about activities on Mr. Walker's property, and every single one of them has been determined to be false or misleading. Filing false police reports is a misdemeanor offense in this county, and we take it very seriously." The crowd of neighbors had gone quiet, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Victoria looked around nervously, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Deputy Gray pulled out his notebook and continued his explanation, while my neighbors listened in fascination. "Mrs. Knight, you've reported unauthorized water vehicle use on public property. False because the lake is private. You've reported environmental violations. False because the state inspector found no violations. You've reported noise ordinance violations. False because private property recreational activities don't violate our noise ordinances. And most seriously, you've reported threats and intimidation, which our investigation shows never occurred." With each item he listed, Victoria seemed to shrink a little more, and several of her own HOA neighbors were shaking their heads in disbelief at the scope of her false reporting. "But more importantly," Deputy Gray continued, "I need to see that property deed one more time for our official report, because Mrs. Knight's complaints keep mentioning community property and public water features." I handed him my deed folder, which now included all the additional documentation I'd gathered over the past few weeks. As he opened the folder and began reading the property description aloud, I could see his shoulders starting to shake with suppressed laughter. "She filed reports about a private lake that's been in your family since 1987. Deputy Gray laughed until he wiped tears from his eyes. The deputy's professional composure finally cracked, and he started laughing out loud. "Ma'am, you've been calling the police to complain about a man jet skiing on his own private lake." The absurdity of the situation hit everyone at the same time, and most of my neighbors joined in the laughter. "I've been doing this job for 5 years, Deputy Gray continued, still chuckling. "And this is the first time someone has reported a crime that consists entirely of a property owner using his own property legally." Victoria was standing there looking mortified as the reality of her situation finally sank in. She'd spent weeks harassing me and filing false police reports about activities that were completely legal on my own private land. "Mrs. Knight," Deputy Gray said, becoming serious again, "you're being cited for filing false police reports, which carries a fine of up to $500 per incident. You're also being issued a formal warning about harassment, and any future false reports will result in misdemeanor charges and possible jail time." He handed her a citation and continued, "Additionally, you're legally prohibited from contacting Mr. Walker or entering his property for any reason. If you have legitimate concerns about noise or environmental issues, you need to contact the appropriate agencies directly." not the police. Victoria took the citation with shaking hands, clearly understanding that her campaign of harassment had not only failed, but had resulted in serious legal consequences for herself. As Deputy Gray prepared to leave, he approached me privately with a huge smile on his face. "Mr. Walker, I have to tell you, this case is going to be legendary at our station," he said, still chuckling. "We deal with a lot of neighbor disputes, but I've never seen anyone work so hard to get themselves in trouble over something so completely legal. You handled this perfectly. You documented everything, you stayed within your rights, and you let her dig her own hole." He paused and looked back at Victoria, who was slowly walking toward her house with her head down. "Between you and me, we've been getting complaints about Mrs. Knight's HOA management from other residents for months. This citation might be the push the community needs to make some changes." As the patrol car drove away, my neighbors continued the barbecue with a much more festive atmosphere. Olivia approached me with a proposal that I hadn't expected. "Lucas, several of us have been talking, and we think it's time for a change in HOA leadership," she said. "Would you be willing to attend our next emergency meeting and help us understand property rights and community law? I think the whole neighborhood could benefit from someone who actually knows what they're talking about." I agreed to help, realizing that Victoria's harassment campaign had inadvertently brought the community together against her authoritarian leadership style. Over the next few weeks, the changes in the neighborhood were dramatic and satisfying. Victoria Knight was voted out as HOA president by an overwhelming margin, with Olivia Harrington winning the election to replace her. The new HOA board immediately rescinded most of Victoria's excessive rules and regulations, including the restrictions on children's play equipment and the requirements for specific mailbox colors. Victoria herself put her house up for sale within a month, unable to face the daily humiliation of living next to the lake she'd tried so hard to control. The for sale sign on her lawn became a symbol of justice for everyone who'd suffered under her petty tyranny. The best part of the whole resolution was that my weekend jet ski rides became a neighborhood tradition. Olivia's new HOA policy specifically acknowledged private property rights, and several families asked if their children could occasionally use the lake for swimming and fishing. My private ranch lake became a community asset in the best possible way, through mutual respect and voluntary cooperation, rather than authoritarian control. Every time I see Deputy Gray driving through the neighborhood, he waves and grins. And I know he's still telling the story of the HOA president who called the police to report crimes that consisted entirely of a man using his own property legally. And that's the story of how a simple property deed can make a deputy laugh until tears come to his eyes. How an HOA president learned an expensive lesson about property boundaries, and why sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them defeat themselves through their own unreasonable behavior. The lake is still as beautiful as ever, the jet ski still runs perfectly, and the private ranch lake sign has become a beloved neighborhood landmark that reminds everyone about the importance of respecting property rights and treating neighbors with basic human decency. Sometimes justice comes in the form of legal consequences, and sometimes it comes in the form of a law enforcement officer laughing at the sheer absurdity of someone's overreach. In Victoria Knight's case, she got both, and the whole community is better off for it. From all of us here at HOA Unleashed, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.